All right, everybody, welcome to class. Today we will go ahead and get started. So yesterday we were talking about France getting into the French Revolution. The French Revolution being the exact opposite as to what the American Revolution was, and I talked about how the American Revolution was conservative and the French Revolution was radical. Now, we are this week going to talk more about, we're going to define what I mean when I say radical and conservative. Because we live in this world and you hear someone talking about, well, we're conservative. What does conservative mean? Well, in all realities, conservative, and this is one of the things you'll need to know, especially when you get out into the world, especially when you get to the point where you'll be voting and you'll be getting to the point where you need to understand the consequences of voting. And you'll need to realize something. When I say conservative, I mean a particular definition. Because you could probably guess that conservative just means to conserve that which has already been in place. Which is not a bad definition, but the problem is this. Once you apply that definition, it can be applied in different ways. So when I say conservative, I mean, you look at the American Revolution, you're like, well, wait a minute, how is the American Revolution conservative? Because they were overthrowing a despotic government. How can you say the American Revolution was conservative when they were overthrowing the old order? That sounds more radical than conservative. At least certainly the British would have considered the American Revolution radical and not conservative. Again, it depends on what you define as conserving. The founding fathers in the American Revolution were conserving, not the monarchy. If you're defining conservatism as only retaining the monarchy, then no, the American Revolution wasn't conservative. But if you define the American Revolution as conservative in the terms I'm meaning, which is the principles of Montesquieu and Rousseau and John Locke, those principles that had existed for years prior to the American Revolution, then yes, it was conservative because it was conserving those rights, conserving those ideas against a despotic government. Versus the French Revolution that was so radical that it very quickly moved away from the principles of John Locke and of Rousseau and all of these Enlightenment thinkers that talked about men having rights that were guaranteed to them. So when I talk about conservative versus radical, I mean the American Revolution was conservative because it wanted to conserve the ideas of Rousseau and Locke, these Enlightenment ideas, versus the French Revolution that wasn't conservative because they started out talking about those ideas, the ideas of Rousseau and Montesquieu and Locke, but then very quickly they moved away from that. Yesterday's lesson that you read should prove to you that they very quickly moved away from those principles and began openly showing that, for instance, the freedom of religion was not followed. Freedom of speech wasn't followed. If you were opposing the revolutionary government, guess what? They had you decapitated with the guillotine. They started out trying to conserve the ideas of Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau, but they very quickly moved towards the same tyrannical government that they had moved away from. Now, this was the last note you had yesterday, and now we're getting into a new section, and this is on page number 404 in your book. So we're talking about the Napoleonic era. Now, the Napoleonic era is so named for the titular individual that impacted this era. And you guessed it, it's Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was a revolutionary officer, in fact. He was on the side of the government during the French Revolution, and he proved himself to be a very, very capable military commander. By the way, one of the myths about Napoleon was that he was a short individual. In all reality, he wasn't short. The reason he's always been stereotyped as short is because a town that he was walking through at the time, they were describing him and writing it down, and they described him as being, 5 feet something. But the problem was they were using a different metric. So based on the metrics we use today, especially the metrics we use in the U.S., he really wasn't all that short. But that's one of those things that's followed him for the rest of his life and the rest of his memory. But anyway, Napoleon, he was an officer. He attended the military academy in France prior to the revolution. Once the revolution took place, he signed up in the military and was hailed as a hero because during the French Revolution, France went to war with just about everybody. And he was one of the generals that, on a consistent basis, won victories on behalf of France. He was chosen by the Directory. Remember that type of government that we talked about at the end of the lecture yesterday. The Directory, which was a panel of 9 directors. These directors were appointed, or nominated rather, these 5 men, I think I might have said 9. These 5 directors, they were nominated by the Council of 500, and then they were confirmed in the Council of Ancients. The Directory chose him to lead France's army against the Austrians in their war with Austria, and he was very, very successful. But, as with many cases, Napoleon became too popular with the people, and the Directory very quickly became jealous and fearful of Napoleon's popularity. To get him out of Paris, they directed him to invade England, which was a fool's errand. But here, Napoleon is. He's been ordered to invade England, and he rejected this idea. He decided instead to attack Egypt in order to cut off Britain's trade with the Near East. So he could argue he was attacking Britain. He just wasn't attacking the British homeland. He was attacking their colony in Egypt. And his idea was we cancel them out of Egypt, and we'll end up better off in the long run. He went to war and fought against the English Lord Nelson. He was a famed naval British officer, and Lord Nelson beat him. Now, Lord Nelson lost his life for the trouble, but Napoleon did officially lose this battle in Egypt. However, that didn't matter because he returned to France, and many people didn't know he had been beat by the British in Egypt. So he comes back into town, and all of Paris is screaming for him. They love him. They want him to be their leader. And the Directory very quickly realized, we probably should have just kept him around here, because by sending him off to fight the British, he's become more of a folk hero. And so they figured out that it wasn't exactly the best plan. It backfired on them. And he eventually instituted what's called a coup d'etat. Now, a coup d'etat you find is on page number 405. I don't have it in these notes. That's my bad. But I do want you to know what a coup d'etat is. A coup d'etat on page number 405. Once Napoleon entered Paris, he staged a successful coup d'etat, which is a sudden and illegal seizure of power by force. By the end of 1799, a new government called the Consulate was formed under yet another constitution. They're going through so many different constitutions in France at this time. But Napoleon, he created what's called the Consulate. And this Consulate was formed off the basis of the Roman Consulate. If you remember when we talked about it, the Roman system of government during the Republic, what happened was there was the triumvirate. The triumvirate was the three most powerful people in Rome sharing power. The most famous was Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Well, Napoleon created the Consulate, which, the same way, had 3 consuls that ruled France, but Napoleon, as the chief consul, had the most power. So he formed this new government under this new constitution, and eventually Napoleon would grow bored of this system of government. And so he eventually abolished this government. And after he abolished this government, he established himself as emperor. So you see now the period of history that France has gone through. They've gone through a monarchy to anarchy. Now they're going back to monarchy again because he declares himself to be Emperor of France. After seizing the French government in 1799, Napoleon worked to increase his personal power. In 1802, he held a plebiscite in which the people overwhelmingly agreed to make him the first consul for life. Then in 1804, the French Senate, proclaimed Napoleon to be the Emperor of France. In a spectacular ceremony on December 2nd of 1804 in the Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon took the imperial crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it on his own head. Napoleon was a proud individual, and I don't mean that in a good way. He was a prideful man, and the book doesn't really explain it well enough. He thought himself so magnificent. He thought himself so wonderful that he said no man was worthy of crowning him emperor except himself. He was the only person that was worthy enough to crown himself emperor, not the Pope, not nobody else. He was the only person worthy to crown himself emperor. And so he crowned himself emperor. And this is the problem. When I was at Southview, we watched a play called Macbeth, Shakespeare. And Macbeth is one of my favorite plays. The whole point behind Macbeth is to warn the play watcher about the danger in ambition. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I will tell you Macbeth starts out as a patriotic individual. He loves his country, Scotland, but then he gets told by some witches that he is going to be crowned King of Scotland, and very quickly he finds himself in the situation where he's murdering the king, taking the kingship for himself. And then he's paranoid that anybody else is going to take the throne from him, so he starts executing everybody, including his own friends, in order to ensure that he stays on the throne. Power corrupts. Absolutely, power corrupts. And it corrupted Napoleon. He was prideful. He was arrogant. And guess what? It would end up leading to his own downfall later on. But one of the good things that Napoleon did, he codified the French laws. Again, during the Revolution, the theory was, okay, yeah, we're going to have a written constitution, a written government, and written laws. Well, the problem is that very quickly that got lost in the shuffle. People weren't really abiding by the written law. So Napoleon, and this is a good thing he did, this is his greatest accomplishment and his famous accomplishment, he codified the French laws. And later it would be called the Code Napoleon, meaning he made all of these laws and made them the standard. And he made sure that his underlings kept this power, kept this law. Now, let's talk a little bit about his conquests. So I've got a map to show you exactly what his conquests were, but that's on the next slide. So right now I'm just going to have you write down what it was that he conquered. He conquered the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, if you remember, is comprised mostly of Italy and Germany. So what Napoleon did was he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. He captured them, and then he didn't absorb it into his own empire like so many other people had before. He actually created a new country for the German people, and it was called the Confederacy of the Rhine. But here's the kicker. The Confederacy of the Rhine was considered to be a protectorate, be under the protection of Napoleon. So basically, yes, the Confederacy of the Rhine was its own nation, but they did whatever Napoleon told them to. It's the same thing like when you look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in all reality, you could argue that all of those nations were independent nations. They all had their own rulers. But those rulers were chosen by the Communist Party in Russia, and nobody thinks that the Soviet Union was a confederation of all these different states. They only think of it as all under Russia's thumb. And that's correct. Then the same way here, the Confederacy of the Rhine is considered its own nation, but guess what? Napoleon's pulling the strings. It might as well be his country. Now, furthermore, he subjected Spain. He subjected the Confederacy of the Rhine, as I've already mentioned. He subjected the Kingdom of Italy and the Kingdom of Naples under his protection. So this is basically what it looks like here. At this point, Italy is not united at this point. Italy is a section of all these different kingdoms, and if you look at this map, you've got the northern part of Italy, that's called the Kingdom of Italy. Then the southern part, the actual boot of the Italian peninsula, well, that's called the Kingdom of Naples. And then you've got the Kingdom of Sicily, which is the soccer ball that it looks like Sicily, that the Kingdom of Naples is about to kick. So, you see here, France basically subjected Spain under their control. They subjected the Confederacy of the Rhine under their control. And then he, with his new strength, he created an alliance between the French Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Prussian Empire, the Kingdom of Denmark, and Norway. So basically, all of that is under Napoleon's control, with the exception of the United Kingdom and Portugal. Basically, everything else that's colored is under Napoleon's control. He had a lot under his control. He was basically the master of Europe at this point. Now, one of the ways, because he wanted to find a new way of fighting, and he realized that he did not have the power to conquer everybody all at once, so he came up with a new system of fighting. It was called the Continental System. And the Continental System is this. It used superior land forces to close Europe's ports to British ships. So he wanted Britain a part of his empire. And Britain was not coming quietly. Britain still had the best navy on earth, and a pretty impressive army to boot. And Napoleon, if it were just based on armies, Napoleon might have they might have been at least evenly divided. But there was no mistaking Britain's naval authority. So what Napoleon decided to do is basically create a siege of England. Well, how do you besiege a whole nation? Pretty simple when you use the Continental System. He decided to Napoleon used his armies to capture and to hold all of European ports, and then he would close those ports to British ships. So basically, he expects to starve out the British people because guess what? Now Britain can't get what it needs from other nations. Can't get the food it needs, can't get any of the supplies they need. He basically just wants to starve them out. Now this will end up biting Napoleon in the neck. This will end up hurting him more than it helps him. But in theory, this should have worked. In theory, it should have worked. But the Continental System ended up, and this is going back to what I'm talking about, pride and selfish ambition. Pride and selfish ambition only act as the gun to which you put to your own head as you wait to pull the trigger. That's what pride and ambition is. You end up hurting yourself more than you hurt other people. This Continental System would end up being Napoleon's undoing. So what happens is Napoleon enlists the help of all of the European countries. Again, think back to the map I showed you. Napoleon had pretty much all of Europe under his control, save Russia. Russia would not comply with the Continental System. Russia would not close down their European ports. Because remember, Russia is so large that Russia occupies part of Europe and part of Asia. They call it the Eurasian continent. Eurasian plain, not Eurasian continent. The Eurasian plain. Part of Russia is in Europe. The part of Russia that Moscow is in is considered Europe. But then all the rest of it is considered Asia. Well, in order for the Continental System to work, Napoleon needed Russia to fall in line and say, sure, Napoleon, we'll close our ports to Britain. Well, Russia wouldn't do it. And so now Napoleon has to declare war on Russia in order to force them into compliance. And once he gets control of the European side of Russia, he can force them to comply in closing down their ports to British ships. Now, Napoleon's army was much, much better than the Russian army, without a doubt. There's no question. Napoleon had the better army. But as Napoleon's army was pushing and chasing the Russian army, the Russians decided to burn everything behind them. And this is called a scorched earth policy, in which you, while you're retreating, you burn everything behind you. Saddam Hussein in the 90s and the 1990s, when he invaded Kuwait. He invaded Kuwait for all of its oil resources, so that way they could get more money and therefore fund their conquests against other nations. And the American coalition, President George Bush Sr., Britain, all of these other nations, Iran, all of these other coalition nations invade Kuwait to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, because Kuwait had a lot of oil fields. And Saddam Hussein didn't want the Americans to get the money, to get the oil either. So as the Americans are pushing the Iraqis back across the Kuwaiti border, guess what? Saddam Hussein blows up all the oil fields in his way. So the Americans can't use it. Basically, the Russians did the same thing as Napoleon was chasing them. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a huge problem, because the further Napoleon moves out of his territory, the further east he goes, he is stretching himself farther and farther away from his supply lines. You cannot invade a country without a supply base. Unless you have the food, the water, the balls and gunpowder, musket balls and gunpowder. Unless you have a direct line to get those, guess what? You ain't going to do diddly squat. As the Russians burned everything behind them, Napoleon stretched himself further away from his supply lines, and very quickly, Mother Nature comes into play. Russia's greatest ally is Mother Nature. It happened with Napoleon. It happened with Hitler in the future. They both try to invade Russia, but they invade Russia at the worst possible time, and that's the winter. And Napoleon's troops basically freeze to death because they're so far away from their supply lines. They don't have winter coats. They don't have the implements they need to keep themselves warm over the brutal Russian winter. Meanwhile, the Russians are used to this. This is just another January for them. So the French absolutely fall apart when they try to invade Russia. If Napoleon had just been content with being the master of Europe, as he had already had it, he would have been fine. Eventually he might have lost, but he would have existed a whole lot longer. If he had just existed with Spain, with what was left of the Germans, with the Swedes and Denmark, if he had kept all of that to himself, he would have been fine. The problem was greed and selfish ambition pushed him to his limits. Here is the map of Napoleon's invasion into Russia. They got pretty cotton-picking close. In fact, they actually entered Moscow, the capital. When you enter the capital city, guess what? Theoretically, you have won. But that's not exactly the way it all worked. Listen to what the book has to say about it. Here we go. As the Grand Army, which was Napoleon's army, the name he gave to his own army, the Grand Army, Napoleon and his Grand Army continued to press on, hoping if he could capture Moscow, the Tsar would come to terms. He won several battles along the way, but he could not destroy the Russian army. If you want to be able to pummel the Russian Tsar into submission, you have to take away his army. And as much as Napoleon was able to win these battles, he wasn't able to destroy the Russian army. But when the Russians... Sorry, I've lost my place here. In September of 1812, His army reached Moscow. When Napoleon entered the city, though, he found it abandoned. So Napoleon found Moscow completely empty. The Tsar wasn't there. That night, fire swept through the city, destroying most of it. Napoleon remained in Moscow more than a month, thinking that the Tsar might still surrender. Winter was approaching, however, and Napoleon knew that his troops were clad only in summer uniforms and did not have enough supplies to spend the winter in Moscow. Frustrated, he finally gave his orders to retreat. So he was unsuccessful in capturing the Tsar and forcing a surrender from the Russian Tsar. And even though at this point the only reason Napoleon really lost was because winter came, he really didn't lose any land battles. Winter killed more French troops than the Russians did. So, while this is going on, the nations that still remained in Europe were tired of seeing France take over pretty much everything. And so they come together and form a coalition to knock Napoleon off his horse. The following year, Napoleon once more persuaded the French people to raise an army to defend his empire against a new coalition of European powers. In a long campaign in 1813, Napoleon's forces were finally defeated at Leipzig, Germany, in what has been later called the Battle of Nations. After a series of negotiations, the European coalition forced Napoleon to abdicate. Abdicate means to give up his throne. They allowed him to go to the small island of Elba. So at the Battle of Nations, which took place at Leipzig, Germany, coalition forces, later called the Battle of Nations, forced him to abdicate the French throne. And after he has abdicated, his captors allow Napoleon to reign as emperor of the island of Elba. Now, if you look at your book, Elba is an incredibly small island just off of Italy's coast. This is the picture on page number 409. And you would think that this is just a way to, they stick the knife in and twist it. That's kind of what you get the sense they're doing. Well, yes and no. They definitely want to make this hurt for Napoleon. But at the same time, they actually did make him emperor. He was officially an emperor. He was a world leader. And he was an emperor of that tiny island. And, while he was there, he actually did a pretty decent job as the emperor of Elba. There's a facet here somewhere, and I have lost my place here. It might have actually been in the next chapter. But when he is the emperor of Elba, he actually does a good job. He does a good job here in making Elba self-sufficient. But that's not what he wanted. In fact, they told him, listen, you can be the emperor of Elba, but you have to stay there the rest of your life. And he agreed. For a while, anyway. Only after about a year, Napoleon leaves Elba, and he escapes to Paris once again. And after he enters into Paris, the people once again want him as their emperor, so they make him emperor. Now, he was not emperor from very long after this. He was only in there a couple months. But this second time, he raised an army, and the rest of Europe banded together to fight him. And they fought him at what's known as the Battle of Waterloo. At the Battle of Waterloo, a guy by the name of Duke of Wellington, he defeated Napoleon. This was the last time Napoleon would fight and lose, rather. It was the last time he would fight for control of France. After the Duke of Wellington won, they exiled him. He did not even get the title of an emperor. He was not able to retain control of anything. They said, we gave you control of this small island, then you ticked us off. We're not giving you anything else. after Duke of Wellington won, Napoleon was banished to the island of St. Helena, a little island in the middle of the South Atlantic, and there he lived out his days under guard. He died on May the 5th, 1821, and was buried on the island. In 1840, his body was moved to Paris. Napoleon had said in 1804, "Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." How he must have died, quote, during those 6 years on St. Helena. So even if he had won the Battle of Waterloo, he would not have survived much longer. He only lived about 6 years later. All right, that is the end of today's lecture. Go ahead and make sure you're doing your work. Make sure you're not. Make sure that you're not leaving those to be. Make sure you're not leaving those because, listen, guys, we're online school now, but you can still fail this. I encourage everybody, go online today and look at their grades on iNow, because this is the prime situation for people to do poorly if they think, oh, this is going to be easy. Listen, I'm putting more assignments up because I want you to succeed, not to fail. Because I know how easy it is to forget and to not do things. Make sure you're doing your stuff. It can either help you or it can hurt you. Love you guys, and just want you to always know that I'm praying for you.